They have rampaged across cities and villages, killing innocent, unarmed civilians.
The bearded man demands his prisoners repeat, Islamic State here to stay.
They target Muslims and religious minorities, murdering them when they can.
We are an Islamic army.
They're a bunch of psychopaths.
Paraded on a beach in orange jumpsuits before being murdered.
It's their typical combination of Hollywood production quality and just gratuitous violence.
All of us are fighting extremism all over the world.
ISIS is now metastasizing.
The fall of Mosul was a political failure and a military failure.
Iraq is a part of the war on terror.
Syria was a godsend for us.
Their ambition to commit genocide against an ancient people.
We must not be so frozen with fear.
ISIS and Hamas are branches of the same poisonous tree.
ISIL speaks for no religion.
We will follow them to the gates of hell until they are brought to justice.
The situation today is what bin Laden could have only dreamed of.
Because hell is where they will reside. Hell is where they will reside.
Colin Powell made a speech to the UN in 2003 as justification for the coalition going into Iraq.
The American came into the country without knowing the nature of this country.
There were catastrophic strategic mistakes made after Baghdad fell on April 9th.
Could ISIL have done so well without the Baathists on their side?
ISIS successfully taps into several narratives, all of them that play to victimhood. The victim narrative plays to 2003, we lost Saddam Hussein.
That is when this problem from hell began.
When the Americans landed in Iraq in late March 2003 and overthrew a system, it wasn't just an issue of regime change. They overturned a decades or even a centuries-old system of power, privilege, and patronage.
In 2003, and after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, we have had a rosy dream of building a new, prosperous, stable, secure, united Iraq, built on our 5,000 years of civilization, history. Unfortunately, that was all shattered.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
لحظة سقوط تمثال صدام حسين بترمز بشكل جيد إن ذاك التمثال بالذات وهو في طريقه للسقوط أمن الخليج الإقليمي كله إلى يعني سحبه كله معه أو معه.
The US-led invasion of Iraq took just 6 weeks to bring Saddam Hussein's 24-year rule to an iconic end.
Other nations in history have fought in foreign lands and remain to occupy and exploit. Americans, following a battle, want nothing more than to return home.
It would be another 8 years before US troops would leave Iraq.
The country was run by one person, Saddam Hussein. Then you remove that person and not attending to the country for more than 100 days. It amounts to be a gross negligence by the American administration then.
With the country shorn of its leader and its government, what began as an invasion soon turned into an occupation.
In short, it was chaotic. A lot of the chaos that occurred was not anticipated.
Ali Kederi was special advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority, the US-dominated body tasked with governing an increasingly violent Iraq.
Despite what we were being told by various agencies and by the military, it was very clear to me in the summer of 2003, in the fall particularly, that there was an insurgency that was gearing up. The violence numbers were increasing, the casualties were increasing, and frankly, just because I spoke the language, I heard daily that there were rising attacks.
At that point, the response to the United States was mainly denial. Particularly, there was a sense, perhaps, of arrogance that with the size and scope of the US forces there, that who would care to raise arms against them.
Government Minister Ali Alawi worked to restore order during the early years of Iraq's occupation, along with National Security Advisor Muaffaq al-Rabai.
I remember Jerry Bremer came to see me and said, Muaffaq, what is happening? Who is shooting at us? Who is killing Americans? And it was a very simple phenomena to analyze, that the Baathists have started to rebel and took arms, and also some of the jihadists. So that amalgamation of Baathist, Salafist, that's a new, strange creature, if you like.
As head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, Paul Jerry Bremer's first official order was to ban the deposed Ba'ath Party in all forms. It was a decision that both the Americans and Iraqis would come to regret.
Disbanding the army and setting up the De-Baathification Commission, which became a tool of political vengeance in Ahmed Chalabi's hands. We never recovered from those things because hundreds of thousands of people became unemployed, disillusioned, disenfranchised, and took to insurgency.
The concept, the central concept of de-Baathification was right. To de-Baathifize, like to denazify. This is from the de-Baathification as originated from denazification, because this is a fascist, brutal, sectarian dictatorship by Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. Now, to de-Baathifize the ideology, not the individuals. But when you come and implement the law, it was implemented with a political settling scores.
Were the Americans aware that that was being done in their name, really?
Yes, absolutely. Many of us were aware that that was happening, warned against it, lobbied the White House and others to stop this, because what we did not want it to become was a sectarian witch hunt. But many other politicians hijacked the De-Baathification Commission and leveraged it for political or personal or financial reasons, including extortion and blackmail. And it directly fed into the popularity and the rise of the insurgency, which directly fed into, because of the disenfranchisement and disillusionment Dr. Abai talked about, fed into Al-Qaeda's strength.
Probably this is partly has contributed to the insurgency. I don't know whether this is the main reason. I think the main reason that a minority community has lost the political power, economic interest, social status, and they resorted to violence to regain this power.
I wanted to ask you, Martin, the end result of de-Baathification was the Baathists decided to meet up with the Salafists. What do we know about the individuals? What do we know about the Baathists that did decide to, jump into this group and form this alliance? What sort of background have we heard about?
A core group of former officers, senior officers, colonel level and above, in Saddam Hussein's military, did form an alliance of convenience with the Salafist jihadists, who, it must be said, before the war were arch enemies. Saddam's regime did not trust organised political Islam at all, let alone the jihadist current. But by the time they got together, there was a powerful organising principle that the Baathists could bring to the table. But I just wanted to add just one thing to what Dr. Abai was saying. All of these things about the Sunnis, who were the majority of the Baathists, losing power, losing social status, all of that's true, as is the total lack of reconciliation or re-empowering them back into the communities. But one simple point that keeps coming back in every discussion I have was not just so much a stripping of status, but a stripping of personal dignity. And personal dignity is a key driver of human behaviour in the Arab world. When that's taken away from you, as it was to many of these people, we have seen reactions such as this, which have helped form this catastrophic current that we have now, and it should never be diminished. I mean, that was very, very important to a lot of the motivations.
Please don't get me wrong, Martin. What I am saying, and I have to admit, that there are hundreds of strategic, tactical, and operational mistakes in security, in economy, in politics, in services. It's been committed over the last 12 years by the Americans, by the Iraqis, by the regional players. So the mistakes have been committed. There is no doubt about it. But I think the very interesting question is this holy, unholy alliance between Baathism and I would say Wahhabism.
Two disaffected constituencies who had been mortal enemies for many years had finally decided that they had some common ground. And it was, just a variation on the ancient mantra of my enemy's enemy is my friend.
They aligned what was supposed to be a temporary alliance to try to, again, bleed and exhaust the United States or its so-called puppets in Baghdad.
The improvised nature of Sunni attacks now combined with the Baathist know-how, the insurgency moved to a new scale of terror.
The first major manifestation of it was the assassination of Ayatollah Baqir al-Hakim and a car bomb that took dozens of lives. It was a planned, well-executed, highly political act, which showed that there was something behind it. It wasn't just a one-off type of violence, that it was part of a program.
The August 2003 Imam Ali Mosque bombing in Najaf was aimed directly at Iraq's Shia hierarchy. But for the US, Sunni violence against Shia targets was not the primary concern.
The more serious element of it was not seen to be the insurgency, the Sunni-based insurgency, but rather the various uprisings associated with Muqtada al-Sadr.
Well, Muqtada had started to organise the Mahdi army that made no bones about what they were fighting for, and that was to defend Shia interests.
By the spring of 2004, there were two insurgencies. There was the Sunni insurgency in the central part of the country, and then there was a southern Shia insurgency led by Muqtada Sadr, a relatively radical Shia cleric, also exploiting the opportunity really to try to drag the US into a quagmire, to exhaust it, to humiliate it, and to ultimately get it to withdraw.
The US invasion of Iraq had spawned two insurgencies, igniting an increasingly sectarian conflict. No one embraced the apocalyptic vision of a Sunni-Shia war more than the man used to justify American aggression.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
They were talking about Zarqawi as being this potent force, and he in fact wasn't the force that he turned out to be a couple of years later.
From his terrorist network in Iraq, Zarqawi can direct his network in the Middle East and beyond.
Contrary to American claims, the Jordanian Zarqawi had no formal alignment with al-Qaeda or its leadership before 2003. A year later, with coalition troops in control of Iraq, the once lone wolf jihadists had become the figurehead of the Sunni insurgency.
His group of Tawheed wal-Jihad acknowledged the leadership of al-Qaeda and Zawahiri and rebranded itself as al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. And at that point, he became, as it were, the poster boy of the insurgency. And for a while, his antics and his extreme violence began to cast, as it were, a shadow on all the other insurgent groups.
He was trying to portray himself as a Rambo of the Muslim world. Zarqawi revolutionized the ideology of al-Qaeda. See, al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri was built on anti-Americanism. Now, Zarqawi started to introduce the sectarian element of it, which is anti-Shia element. And once the sectarian war erupted, then you get a failed dysfunctional state, and this is the best environment the jihadists will work.
Zarqawi had started to organize them, started to instill a discipline and a fervor, and emerge as somebody who was going to lead a nascent mujahideen. And this pantomime villain, this fervent ideologue, had really started to take control of the post-invasion months in Iraq.
A year after claiming Iraq had ties to al-Qaeda, America's falsehood became a self-fulfilling prophecy, with Zarqawi center stage.
So he became like Al Capone, or public enemy number one. It became very easy then to focus all attention to him, being a very small but extremely violent group whose acts are far louder and create a much bigger bang than their reality.
The Americans were very quick to pick up on the threat from Zarqawi in 2004, and at that point, if you recall, we saw the first of the Western hostages in orange jumpsuits who were paraded in front of very grainy cameras in dark rooms with terrifying men with knives standing behind them. Zarqawi was in one of those videos.
A man named Zarqawi is responsible for planting car bombs and beheading Americans. He swore his allegiance to Osama bin Laden. Our troops will defeat Zarqawi and his likes overseas in Iraq so we do not have to face them here at home.
The American president's rallying words failed to stop the beheading of US contractor Nick Berg. None of the masked men involved in the killing could be identified, but the video of Berg's final moments claims Zarqawi as main executioner. The US standard issue orange jumpsuit and the staged spectacle of brutality would now become familiar markers of a new phase in terror focused around one figure.
To the news that Abu Musab al-Zakwari, the top
After this, catching Zarqawi, the number one bad guy in country.
Musab al-Zarqawi is responsible for...
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi have claimed responsibility for many of the beheadings and bombings in Iraq.
The focus was on Zarqawi as an individual, and the way that the media works and the way that the US wanted to portray the insurgency was by limiting it to the acts of a mad, insane terrorist who has this bloodlust.
At the beginning of 2006, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's al-Qaeda in Iraq claimed responsibility for an act that would tear the country apart.
Zarqawi was successful in triggering the sectarian war by bombing the two shrines in Samarra. That combination of acts of terrorism and lack of proper response from the government, which entered us into 2 years of civil war. I used to collect more than 100 bodies cold-bloodedly killed from the street of Baghdad every day. And that was really depressing.
The bombings generated a counter-terror led by a large number of groups affiliated or associated with the Shia militias and connived at, or to some extent supported by elements in the Iraqi government. So the destruction of the Askari shrine and the entry into the fray of the major Shia militias, the war in Iraq began to take the form of a kind of civil war.
By April of 2006, al-Qaeda in Iraq was fighting both an insurgency and a sectarian war, leaving the country awash with blood. An emboldened Abu Musab al-Zarqawi issued his first public statement in a video warning George W. Bush of greater violence to come.
لماذا لا تخبرهم عن هرب جنودك الجماعي والتمرد المتنامي بين صفوف جنودك؟ فاعلم أيها الكذاب الأشر بأن أحلامك دونها دماؤنا وأشلاؤنا والقادم أدهى وأمر بعون الله تعالى.
1 month later, President Bush's dream of bringing democracy to Iraq was coming true. Nouri al-Maliki became Iraq's first democratically elected prime minister.
هذا الشعب الأبي الذي اختار هذه الحكومة عبر صناديق الانتخابات.
For many years, Nouri al-Maliki was a relatively low-level member of the Dawah party who was involved in covert operations to try to bring about the overthrow of the Ba'ath regime and Saddam Hussein's rule.
أمامنا التحدي الأول هو التحدي الأمني وكيفية مواجهة هؤلاء القتلة الإرهابيين.
Many people were tortured or rounded up and disappeared as a result of associations with Dawah.
هؤلاء ينبغي أن يعلموا بأن هذه الحكومة قد صممت بالطريقة التي ينبغي أن تواجه هذا التحدي بكل كفاءة إن شاء الله.
He was involved in organizing acts of resistance, I would call it, against the Ba'athist regime out of a base in Syria. He was not frankly, on anyone's radar screen as a potential prime minister.
First, he was in charge of de-Ba'athification, and then we selected him to be prime minister in 2006.
There was a lot of horse trading, a lot of jostling for power and influence. Muqtada and others were looking to advance their interests by swinging their weight behind Maliki.
We were warned by some of his political rivals about his sectarianism at the time, but there are bad options and there are worse options, and there are really bad options. So what you have to do really is try to calculate what you perceive to be the least worst option and go with it. And frankly, that was the case with Maliki in 2006.
Nouri al-Maliki had come to power echoing George W. Bush's warning to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The new government was ready to meet the challenge of defeating the Sunni insurgents.
On the target.
A month after Iraq's first democratic elections, Zarqawi was killed in a US airstrike.
By that point, he had ignited a full-blown sectarian war. Iraq was out of control. There were 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per month for the best part of 9 months of that year, and the country looked completely beyond any hope at all. The Sunni insurgency was raging. There were a number of leaders around the country who could step up and take his place, and several in fact did.
Stepping up to fill the void at the top of al-Qaeda in Iraq was one of its founders, Abu Ayyub al-Masri. By October 2006, the group had merged with other Sunni insurgents. Al-Masri announced the formation of a new entity, the Islamic State of Iraq, and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi as its emir. The fledgling state would soon face the Sunni insurgency's most critical challenge. Early in 2007, the insurgent group that had been an offshoot of Al-Qaeda Central had evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq. It was a bullish move that forced the American occupiers into a dramatic shift.
America will change our strategy to help the Iraqis carry out their campaign to put down sectarian violence and bring security to the people of Baghdad. This will require increasing American force levels. So I've committed more than 20,000 additional American troops to Iraq.
The insurgency continued to rage with no real blow to its momentum until later that year, when the awakening actually started to take some sort of hold in Anbar province.
The US successfully cut a wedge, as it were, between the extreme violence of the mainly Al-Qaeda-inspired insurgents and their Sunni Arab tribal base, taking advantage of the indiscriminate use of violence and terror by Al-Qaeda against its own base.
The so-called awakening, the Sahwa, that saw Sunni tribes unite against the newly announced Islamic State of Iraq, was supported by a surge of US troops. The goal was simple: wipe out the insurgency.
By January 2007, there was a strategic cooperation between the tribes and the Americans, and that was then used to try and get on the front foot for the first time in several years. At the same time, Zarqawi's replacement, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, had stepped up and was starting to try and assert his will across an insurgency which for the first time was under some serious threat.
One of the secrets of the surge was the US government working with the Sunni tribes across Anbar, Salahuddin, Nineveh, and Diyala provinces to put them on the payroll, give them a means of earning a living rather than throwing them, to the wolves with the Ba'athis and Al-Qaeda. And when we put them on the payroll, nearly 100,000 of them, we saw that with our support and our financing and our weapons, they were able to obliterate Al-Qaeda within a span of really months.
It seemed like a winning strategy, but in a rapidly failing state, the line between ally and enemy was increasingly blurred.
We should understand, though, I think, some legitimate reservations about some of these groups. They were, in many cases, insurgent groups. It took us a few years to get past the fact that these individuals had our blood on their hands.
Ironically, some of these guys were the same guys that were already fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in preceding years. So it's a very complicated situation where we were allying with essentially Al-Qaeda affiliated groups to fight Al-Qaeda on the pretext that they weren't actually Al-Qaeda, but they were only Al-Qaeda affiliated. And we were just pouring money into this.
The combination of US troops and Sunni tribes had beaten back the Islamic State of Iraq. But as America's focus shifted to building ties with local tribes, the Maliki government was breaking promises made to their leaders.
General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker went into Prime Minister Maliki repeatedly and said, okay, we have spent billions of dollars supporting them, but now they're Iraqi citizens, they're helping you maintain security and stability, you need to put them on your payroll. He refused, dragged his feet for years. And so when Al-Qaeda or others came offering cash, they had no choice but to accept.
The US thought that the insurgency had died out, relying on this, to some extent, romanticized tribal force called Al-Sahwa as being somehow the guarantor of stability and security in the Sunni Arab areas. People thought that was the end of the Islamic State. At least that is what we were led to believe.
This insurgency that had been kicked off in 2004 had not been strategically defeated. It was a lull. They'd been scattered, they'd been disorganized, they'd been disorientated, but they were able to overrun Iraqi state security forces more or less at will. They maintained a potent tactical threat to US forces while they remained in Iraq. And it became clear that the steel that had been instilled into the Al-Qaeda group, or the earliest incarnation of what we now know as the Islamic State, remained.
But it was seen to be a rapidly shrinking force. Many of its leaders were apprehended, some killed, but mainly apprehended, and then incarcerated in a camp in southern Iraq called Camp Baka.
By the end of 2007, after the death of almost 100,000 Iraqi civilians and over 4,000 coalition troops, the prevailing narrative was of a fatally weakened Islamic State of Iraq. Failures of policy and foresight that had dogged the US occupation had supposedly been overcome, but at that same moment, they were being repeated at Camp Buka.
Camp Buka and other military facilities ended up being luxury radicalization centers.
They were the best environment, the best school, where the jihadists were trained and taught.
Camp Buka became an incubator for an insurgency.
The joke among all the troops was, if I ever have to come back to Camp Buka, I want it to be as a detainee.
Built by the Americans at the start of the occupation, Camp Buka's first detainees came from the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. Buka would make right everything Abu Ghraib got wrong. That, at least, was the idea.
Right there, the whole ideology behind Buka is there will not be another Abu Ghraib on this commander, this task force, this anybody's watch.
In contrast to Abu Ghraib, we had teachers and some of the best health care ever provided. It was relatively comfortable for an internment facility in a war zone, certainly much more comfortable than an Iraqi facility where torture, and rape and other atrocities were widespread.
The Americans, by that point, had reached thinking that who do we trust here in this society? Everybody hates us. We came here as liberators and now we're occupiers. How do we trust anyone here? So we want to get them all together. We want to sequentially vet them and decide who's against us and who we could work with. That was the intention, but the effect was something completely to the opposite. There were large numbers of people who weren't against them in the first place when they went into Bucca, who were very much against them when they were released.
The Americans cast a wide net, rounding up thousands of Iraqi men, young and old, Sunni and Shia. A catch-all attempt to establish security and fire a shot across the bowels of the Islamic State of Iraq became instead a shot in the arm.
They regrouped right under the noses of their captors, and they assessed what went wrong, and they plotted their return back into the field.
The camp was split into two areas, one for the Shias and one for the Sunnis. But it was the Sunnis who used this long period of internment to instill some kind of an ideological fever, a battle readiness into those who felt the indignity of actually being taken there. And also there were numerous leaders who were committed to an ideological cause, who did buy into the preordained worldview that this was an existential fight against a mortal foe.
When you maybe put 10 radicals together and said these are the worst of the worst, as it was aptly described, it then became a management seminar for upper echelons of ISIS.
Those people mixed up with these impressionable younger people from the streets of Anbar and Baghdad were a potent mix.
Australian journalist Martin Chulov met one high-ranking member of the Islamic State of Iraq, a man with first-hand experience of Camp Bucca.
One man who I've met was an inmate at Camp Bucca. I call him Abu Ahmed. Before he got to Bucca, shooting at American tanks with RPGs and along the highway near Fallujah was almost an adventure. He believed in it. He believed that a fight against an occupation was a just fight. But in Bucca, he started to buy into an ideology.
Retired US Army Captain Mitchell Gray was stationed at Camp Bucca and witnessed both the radicalization of detainees and measures to counter jihadist ideology.
The feeling was if you could have legitimate religious experts come in and give religious classes and talk to them about the true meaning of the Quran, and to show that some of the verses that maybe a radical Islam is using to justify violence, that there's another interpretation to that this will help them understand their own religion better and will act as a deterrent.
Ambassador Crocker and I received briefings from General Doug Stone, who was in charge of internment operations, and he warned us that they believed that some of the prison populations, including at Bucca, or especially at Bucca, were being radicalized, and they were doing various things to try to de-radicalize the populations, but obviously that didn't take root, or didn't take root enough.
It showed how impossible General Stone's task really was, because in the end, no matter how he sliced it and diced it, there were going to be problems and consequences, however that came up.
We told them several times on record, this is going to be a real time bomb in future. And all of a sudden, they were in a hurry to release them. And in a few weeks' time, they released more than 100,000.
These people went back into their towns and villages, and in that period, the Islamic State, which has been written off as a sort of had-been insurgency group, was successfully regrouping, but they were never seen to be as being capable of coming back as a formidable insurgency.
I recall sitting with the American ambassador, Ryan Crocker at the time, receiving a series of lengthy briefings from a Marine two-star general, Doug Stone, who was running detainee operations for the coalition. And General Stone was extremely sharp. I think you remember him, Dr. Bai. And we knew that radicalization was going on. This is in the 2007-8 period. And we were trying to do various things to stop it, but frankly, because Abu Ghraib had been the center of torture and rape under Saddam Hussein, and then because of the abuses that we saw in 2004, that maximum security facility was shut down, and Buka, I think from my recollection, we had about 30,000 prisoners there. I believe somewhere between 90 and 99% were Sunni. So what you ended up having was many were guilty of various things or thought to be guilty. Many were swept up because, again, of the civil war, and they were just swept up sort of on suspicion, but hadn't done anything. But what ended up happening was you had a witch's brew, a toxic brew of hardcore jihadis, people who hadn't done anything, but they were there nonetheless and were thus radicalized. It became the perfect incubator for transnational jihad, particularly because a few years later, the U.S. was obviously forced to leave Iraq, and all of these individuals were let go.
But if they had intelligence, why didn't they think this is not a clever idea? We're putting all these moderates and more fundamentalists together, and they are basically radicalizing the more moderates.
Well, again, we knew about it, and the military was taking steps to address it. But what are you going to do with 30,000 people? I mean, you can't put all of them in solitary confinement.
You mentioned General Stone, the two-stars guy. I'm not sure that he understood that time bomb called Camp Buka.
We could have never imagined it.
I kept on telling the American then, this is going to explode in our face in the very near future.
Look, Dr. Rubai, we spent over 2,000 days together in the Green Zone. He was National Security Advisor. I was Special Assistant to 5 American ambassadors. Let's be very honest with each other. The United States government deserves a lot of blame for what happened in Iraq. But frankly, so do Iraqis. Again, we spent over $2.7 trillion in Iraq, is the last count of the Congressional Budget Office. Where was the Iraqi government? You know, we did many things wrong. We set up this facility, it became a radicalization center. But as I just told you, the Iraqi prisons were sites of endemic rape, torture, and other human rights abuses if Iraqi citizens were that lucky. They were just being shot on the streets by the Iraqi security services and the militias. Am I right?
No, I don't agree on that, Ali. I'm sorry. I certainly do not agree on that. Now, the people in the Iraqi prisons, at least their relatives can see them. I'm not saying that Iraqi prisons were the ideal prisons. Okay, there were some inhumane things committed in these prisons. True, because we are in a state of war, continuous state of war. But I think that Camp Buka is a real disaster, and the Americans suffer of this, I call it chronic recurrent short-termism. They're short-sighted. They can't see behind their nose. I can see it happening. I can see people are coming out of this detention center, brainwashed.
But did you say this to the Americans?
Of course.
Did you tell them?
Of course, because those who leave the Americans were there when they detained. When they leave that camp, they go and blame themselves again. And they go and commit another suicide bomb. So we can see, and we put a percentage of those, the number of people. If we release 100 from the Camp Buka, there's going to be at least 15% of these are going to come back and fight us.
So the better.
And despite all these facts and all these statistics, the American kept on releasing people from there and not doing anything inside that camp. As long as it's preventive measures, let dump them there, and what happened after that is nothing, none of our business.
Martin.
I think just briefly on that, I think the statistics are that 18 of the 27 senior ISIS leaders were all veterans of Camp Buka, and I think that speaks for itself.
I would just say, in response to Dr. Rubai, We knew what was happening, you knew what was happening. We really did. The issue, though, is Iraq is the Iraqi people's country and the Iraqi government's country. We were a foreign force and a foreign power that really was intent on doing some good, even though it didn't result in a lot of good. But our intent was, I think, relatively pure. I think we can all agree on that. The issue is, if you saw these problems among the American system, and I wholeheartedly agree with you about the issue of short-termism, why did the Iraqi government not try to set up better alternative facilities? To this day, Dr. Abai.
Because, let me answer.
To this day, if I could just,
because we were under occupation. The occupying force is in charge of security, in charge of economy, in charge of politics. Officially, as of the 15th of May 2003, we were totally...
We handed sovereignty back to you on June 28, 2004, Ambassador Bremer to Ayad Allawi.
No.
You were National Security Advisor.
This is true. This is sovereignty, but from then onward until the end of 2011, the Americans were there with 120, 30, 40,000 soldiers.
At the request of the Iraqi government.
They're there. They're everywhere.
Did you want us to leave earlier?
Well,
we were in the country at your government's request.
Ali, I was of the opinion, and I have put this in writing to the Prime Minister, to Abdulaziz al-Hakim then, and to Sistani, copy. I thought, and I said, the Americans have changed their mind. They're not working with the majority Iraqis. They're now consolidating the Western provinces, their presence there. And I think they should have left by the end of 2007. We would have been in a much better position then. I can tell you honestly that. And this is in writing. This is not a claiming. In handwriting, if I may say so.
So why were you part of the SOFA negotiating team, which I was also a part of?
Well, I was representing my country. And I was representing my Prime Minister.
Right. So you and
I was of the opinion that the Americans should have then, according to the SOFA, and I told the Prime Minister then, and this is the first time I mentioned it, I told the Prime Minister then that I can get the American out within 1 year. The SOFA can last only 1 year and leave them, and by the end of 2009, they could have left as well.
The funny thing is,
the longer the Americans stayed in the country, the more mistakes after mistakes after mistakes they committed in security, in economy, and in politics.
While the insurgency regrouped under the glare of Camp Buka, across the border in Syria, the fate of two nations was being forged away from prying eyes.
There were indications that there were secret meetings between the Assad regime, former Iraqi Ba'athi officers, and then individuals, jihadis, who would one day rise to head ISIL.
Their interest was in destabilizing the American occupation, keeping the Americans off guard across the border. At that point, the Assad regime wasn't sure of what the American intentions were vis-a-vis Syria, whether Syria was next, and there were lots of rumors to that effect.
I went and met President Bashar al-Assad twice and presented him with material evidence, documents, satellite pictures, confession, all sorts of evidence that his security forces were involved in active and transporting a jihadist from Syria to Iraq. And also, there were training camps with names and locations. He was in total denial of that. I remember telling him that this will, in no time, it will backfire on Syria.
President Bashar al-Assad's alliance with jihadists was all about short-term security at a time of heightened paranoia. For the jihadists too, Assad and the Baathists were simply a means to an end.
But whatever the motivation, the effect was very clear, that the senior leaders of the Islamic State group are sitting down with senior Baathists, in particular a guy who became essential to the latest incarnation of ISIS, a guy called Haji Bakr.
I interrogated one of these ISIL guys. Now he said, all our meetings, we have a guy who hides his face, clean shaved. He's not the Amir, he's the deputy Amir. But no decision is made without consulting him.
Nobody knew much about him. He was so effective in remaining low profile that there was barely a photograph of him. There was barely an understanding of what role he was playing, what he was doing, or where he was.
He doesn't take part in the prayer. He doesn't practice Islam. And his jargon is not the jihadi jargon. It's the Ba'athist, Pan-Arabist, Arab nationalist jargon.
Who knew a lot about how to create a state system, and certainly how to create institutions which would serve that system.
The alliance between Baathists and Salafists conspired in secret, while insurgents plotted in prison. A troubling perfect storm had been brewing since the US invasion of Iraq. But by 2009, the worst of the turbulence had supposedly been weathered. The Sunni insurgency was considered beaten. The newly created Islamic State of Iraq was drawing breath. The Arab world was on the cusp of an historic upheaval.
ISIL is the product of genocide in Syria.
The Iraqi army was really a machine for making money.
You will find no safe haven.
They already had British and American special forces in Syria training rebel groups.
The amount of oil that ISIL were able to sell was upwards of around $3 to $4 million per day.
If it looks like a terrorist, if it acts like a terrorist, if it walks like a terrorist, it's a terrorist.